Do we send too many people to prison? The government clashes with Lords over its migration bill. And could and should parties do deals after the next election? This is Politics Live. With me today will be joined shortly by Conservative MP and former Minister Alex Shelbrooke, Labour MP Emma Lewell-Buck, SNP MP Philippa Whitford and The Sun on Sunday's political editor Kate Ferguson. Today, what is Keir Starmer up to?
Would you do any deal with the SNP?
No.
Would you ever do a deal with the Liberal Democrats?
Well, look, I want to press on for a Labour majority. That's what we're aiming for. This is a hypothetical question.
Could Keir Starmer and Ed Davey do a deal after the next election? The government's bill to try and stop the small boats is being debated in the Lords. We'll bring you the latest. Scotland's new First Minister has indicated he wants to raise taxes. Is that the right thing to do?
On progressive taxation, let me say unequivocally that I think there is scope for us to go even further.
We'll ask this SNP MP why she's threatening legal action against a prominent Edinburgh comedy club. And, of course, full coverage of Prime Minister's questions from midday. We'll bring you more of that later. Of course, this is the first Prime Minister's questions since the local election results on Friday. Let's start with this story in the Daily Telegraph. You can see the headline there. "We lock up too many prisoners," says the former Conservative Prime Minister John Major. Yes, he gave a speech arguing too many short sentences are pointless. A non-custodial sentence would be more effective and perhaps more fair. He went on to criticise the state of the country's prisons and argued for a focus on the rehabilitation of offenders. So, the opening question to you, Kate Ferguson, is: do we send too many people to prison?
I would be worried that we would be too worried about sending the right people to prison. So it's all very well and good saying our prisons are full to bursting. They really are. But the important thing is, how do we rehabilitate offenders to stop reoffending rates, which are sky high? And that's the important thing. You don't want to rush to put a cap on numbers of prisoners going in for 6 months or less, in case the wrong people aren't being sent to prison and are still allowed on our streets.
It raised a few eyebrows that this was a speech given by a former Conservative Prime Minister, especially one who had Michael Howard as a Home Secretary at the time.
This is not a line I think anyone would use on the doorstep. Correct me if I'm wrong, ladies, but this is not going to be necessarily popular with voters. I wouldn't go door-knocking in the local elections and say, let's send fewer people to prison, fewer people guilty of antisocial behaviour to prison. What do you think about that, guys? I can't imagine that will go down very well.
What do you think? Do we send too many people to prison?
Well, actually, I think we do. In the article, they highlight that, over 40% of those sent to prison are actually for relatively short sentences for non-violent crime. I would agree it's not about setting a numbers cap. It's what are you sending people to prison for? So there's a punishment element. Obviously, with violent prisoners, there's a protection element. But if you actually want to rehabilitate people and reduce reoffending, you don't necessarily want to detach them from all their family support, and you want to deal with underlying issues like addiction and mental health issues, which, frankly, if they're just going round and round a revolving door, never get dealt with.
We've had these conversations, though, haven't we, so many times over the last few decades, and rehabilitation doesn't ever seem to get higher up the agenda when it comes to reforming prisons.
Well, I think evidence is there, but the problem is community service is not a cheap option. You actually have to invest in it, whereas often it's we're spending too much on prisons, so let's cut it, and we don't actually invest in community service that tackles the addiction issues, whether it's alcohol or drugs, actually gives people skills who maybe don't have any and does pay back to the community. So that's part of the problem, the failure to invest in community service.
Do we send too many people to prison?
I mean, just on Philippa's point, she's absolutely right. You know, you've cut all the mental health services, drug and alcohol support services, the probation reforms were absolutely disastrous. And don't be surprised if you cut neighbourhood policing and cut the police force by 20,000, that you're going to end up with more people in prison.
So are there
obvious.
Right, and is that too many?
I think it probably is too many people in prison. You know, if you look at the amount of women who are in prison who've been victims of domestic violence, if you look at some young people who are in prison who shouldn't be there, there's services out there that would be better suited than putting people in prison.
Is it a sentencing issue then? That people are getting sent to prison for minor crimes that shouldn't be dealt with in that way?
I think it's an issue about the support services and the early intervention services in our communities and having those neighbourhood policing, which have been cut.
Do you agree with that in terms of sentencing? You said you would worry about it becoming too difficult then to decide who should go and who shouldn't.
You wouldn't want arbitrary targets. I'm thinking back to my time as a court reporter. I used to sit in magistrates' courts all morning, and you would see the same faces. You'd see that they had long lists of reoffending rates, and clearly something was broken, not working with that. A lot of them did have mental health problems, a lot of drug problems intermixed with that. But I worry that, as grandiose as this and nice as this idea is from Sir John Major, you know, what does he want to do? What does he want to do about it? What's the alternative?
Well, I think we can hopefully talk to a Conservative MP. Well done, you've arrived, and welcome to the programme. What did you make of John Major's speech? Do we send too many people to prison?
I think the speech itself is made with the best of intentions, that you've got to try and do everything you can within the system to try and prevent people going to prison in the first place and doing the reform sector. And obviously, if you look back over years, and I mean this from Labour governments as well, is that a lot of work has tried to be done to rehabilitate prisoners. We very much change our approach now to just lock them up and throw away the key. But I think it's part of a bigger process. But ultimately, if people are reoffending, they do have to go to prison.
All right. Well, as I say, welcome to the programme. We're going to do this story in The Sun today. Sir Keir and Sir Ed in number 10, Nightmare on Downing Street. This is the headline following suggestions that the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, has left the door open to a coalition with the Liberal Democrats if and in the event of a Labour minority administration at the next general election. In other words, if Labour doesn't win enough seats to have an outright majority and form a majority government. Let's have a listen to what Keir Starmer said to the BBC's political editor, Chris Mason, yesterday.
No deal with the SNP. And I'll tell you for why. Because there's a fundamental disagreement. I will never do a deal with a party that thinks that the separation of the United Kingdom is the way forward and putting a border between Scotland and England. I do not believe that that is the way in which the United Kingdom will prosper, and we'll never do a deal because of that.
Would you ever do a deal with the Liberal Democrats?
Well, look, I want to press on for a Labour majority. That's what we're aiming for. This is a hypothetical question.
Well, so's the SNP one, but you answer that directly, but you're equivocal on the Lib Dems.
It's a hypothetical question. I've been clear. I want to press on for a Labour majority.
Very clear then about ruling out any sort of deal with the SNP, with Philippa's party, but not with the Liberal Democrats. Why didn't Keir Starmer just rule that out too?
Well, I think he said it there, didn't he? You know, the SNP want to break up the United Kingdom. We don't want to do that. The Lib Dems don't want to do that. And like Keir said, it is an entirely hypothetical question. You know, after last week's local elections, we are now the largest party in local government. We won 22 councils. The Tories lost 48. We are on the right track. People like what we're saying. We should be working for a Labour majority government, and that is what we are doing.
Right, but you could go into coalition with the Liberal Democrats if you don't win enough seats at the next general election to have an outright majority.
And that's not what we want entirely. We want to win a majority, and we want to be able to be a majority Labour government. But like Keir said, it's a hypothetical question. You're not going to rule it out.
Right, but you did rule it out in terms of a coalition with the SNP.
The Lib Dems don't want to break the United Kingdom up, and you know we've never wanted to do that as a party. So why would we go into power with someone who wants to do that?
It's very clear. Keir Starmer doesn't want to and will not do any deal with your party.
Well, obviously, you know, Keir in the last 6 months or so, I would say, has moved on, which is the new term for U-turns on many other things. So he says one thing now, he may say something different after the election. And obviously, sure, yeah, and things change. John Curtis thinks that in actual fact, the outcome of the local elections is more about Tory collapse than Labour surge. And they're predicting a hung parliament. Now, the message that Keir is sending right now to the party that has won the 8 elections that have occurred since the Scottish referendum is, unless you Scots vote how we tell you, you will have no voice in this government. You have no place to influence a UK government. That's not really a great signal to send out to protect the so-called precious union.
I mean, I think if you look at the SNP, they're like the Tories, aren't they? They're coming
Not
up,
even slightly, Emma.
Their new First Minister is coming up with solutions to solve problems that his party created. Rishi Sunak is trying to come up with solutions to create problems that his party created. Isn't it time that we had someone else in government, a Labour government?
Right. I mean, if that's the case, do you think Philippa's right that actually as we get closer, perhaps, to a general election, or even at the time of a general election, that Keir Starmer might change his mind and might indeed think about doing a deal with the SNP if he needs to?
He's been very clear, no.
So he won't change his mind. Well, there you go.
So he'd rather let the Tories into number 10 if the Liberal Democrats don't get enough to give him control of the House. He'd rather have the Tories in than even have any kind of relationship with the SNP when we have some of the most progressive social policies in the UK, and therefore in a lot of things, social justice, there'll be very little disagreement between us.
But it goes back to that fundamental. You know, I campaigned in the referendum to make sure that United Kingdom wasn't broken up. And that is something I feel incredibly strong about.
More strongly than social justice now.
And a lot of Labour MPs do, and a lot of people in the country do as well. I mean, if you remember, you didn't get the result you wanted in the referendum. You keep banging on about, but you didn't get the result you wanted.
Right. I mean, Philippa, that sounds like you would be quite keen to do a deal with a minority Labour administration in terms of what, confidence and supply? What would be your price?
Well, obviously, it won't be me making that decision. It'll come down to the First Minister at the time. But Nicola Sturgeon was very clear. Well, I think in the short term, there's devolution of things like employment law, which we've seen some appalling actions here at Westminster. But of course, we would want the 2021 Scottish Parliament election, which gave a majority of Scottish parliamentarians in our Parliament supporting a second referendum. And if Labour and Conservatives and Lib Dems believe in the Union and are not afraid of that question, why are they denying Scots the right to make the choice over their own future when the UK has changed utterly since 2014 because of Brexit?
Well, we're not afraid of it. You had your referendum, you just didn't like the outcome.
That was pre-Brexit, Emma. The UK landscape is utterly different.
Although you did say it was a once-in-a-generation. There were no caveats. There were no caveats at the time to say if things change, we'll hold another one.
There was nothing in the Edinburgh Agreement that talked about once-in-a-generation at all.
I mean, Alec, the truth is, of course, whatever happens at the next general election, unless the Conservatives, and it looks very unlikely, get an outright majority, no one's going to do a deal with you. Certainly not the Liberal Democrats after coalition government, with you pretty well left them decimated.
Oh, I think that's fair. I don't think there's anybody in the House who the Conservative Party would deal with. I think
or who would deal with you.
Though, but I mean, whichever way you look at it. But I think all I'll say is this. The former President, Lyndon Baines Johnson, said, first rule of politics, learn to count. This is the spring of 23. The autumn of 24 is probably when the election is going to be. Or to put it another way, 6 test matches, a European Championship. I mean, 2 summers.
You've thought about
There's
this.
a long way to go yet, and things do change, as I think both panellists have just said. I
mean, we have to only go back to recent history, Kate, to remember the 2015 general election and the damage that was done to Ed Miliband, who was the then Labour leader, in the campaign that the Tories ran about him being in the pocket of the then SNP leader, Alex Salmond.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a long old, 12, 18 months to the next election, and I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about the possibility of this coalition with the SNP or the Lib Dems, a formal coalition or some confidence and supply. The interesting thing with both parties is what will their price be? We've heard a bit there from Philippa. We've heard, haven't you, your party also talking about wanting to unpick parts of Brexit and kind of gleefully talking about how they're going to pull the strings of whoever's in power in number 10 next time, because the likelihood would be that it would be a minority government of some form. And so I think we're going to see loads more scrutiny on what the SNP are saying, what the Lib Dems are saying, and what price Labour and Keir might be willing to pay for the keys to number 10. It's been a long time. They're desperate to get back in. Well, what could they give up to get there?
And I just think that we keep talking about coalition, but of course there is supply and confidence.
Absolutely. No, we mentioned that too.
Approach.
Yes. Why do you think that's more likely, a confidence and supply with Liberal Democrats?
I mean, again, it's all hypothetical. Every panellist has said the general election is a long way off. A lot can change in that time. I think it's just, you know, who knows? I mean, I've been an MP 10 years. And I've been up for election in that time 4 times, and there's been 2 referendums.
It's been busy.
So anyone predicting what's going to happen in the next 12 months...
Yeah, it's just the stark contrast, Emma, to anyone watching what Keir Starmer said. He ruled out any sort of agreement with the SNP. That was clear. but he didn't when it came to doing any sort of deal with the Liberal Democrats. So, hypothetical, it may have been in both cases, but he was very adamant about one and not with the Liberal Democrats.
In I don't know how many different ways I can say it, that's because the SNP fundamentally want to break the United Kingdom up, and that's not something we want. And it's not something the people of the country want. And it's not something the Scottish people voted for either.
And yet they keep voting for us. We keep winning elections. We are sitting at the majority of MPs in Scotland. And the message from that clip from Keir Starmer is, unless you vote how we tell you, we won't be listening to you. That's quite a bizarre message to send.
People have already voted.
I think there's one other factor. We talk about referendums. There was, of course, an AV referendum in 2011.
That's the alternative vote, which was looking at other forms of voting.
Keir Starmer's made it clear that PR's not on the agenda, or Wes did. So, I mean, again, when you talk about deals perhaps with the Liberal Democrats, there is a fundamental difference between Labour and the Liberal Democrats, as there is a fundamental difference between Labour and the SNP.
Right. I mean, of course, the other agreement that was made was with the Democratic Unionist Party, which was under Theresa May, and that didn't end very well either. They probably wouldn't look at any sort of supporting of the Conservative Party at the next general election.
I don't think it's a credible coalition or partnership after what we saw last time, and I think in there is the example of where confidence and supply governments can easily fall down. I mean, effectively, that Conservative government never really was able to achieve anything in that 2.5 years. I mean, I've been an MP since 2010. I can categorically tell you that was the worst 2.5 years of my professional career, no matter what I'd been in. It was horrific, and I don't think anything like that will be done by our party again.
Right. Well, you mentioned, actually, that something that Labour and the SNP might share is over taxation, over certain economic principles, being progressive. Let's just show you this headline in The Times. You saw Humza Yousaf, the First Minister, in the headlines of the programme. He's to squeeze Scotland's middle class with taxes on income and second homes, indicating that he wants to go further on taxes, creating a new income tax band for those earning over £75,000. Rishi Sunak, on the other hand, the Prime Minister, is facing pressure from Conservative MPs, probably like Alex Shelbrooke, to cut taxes, since there is the highest tax burden we've had for 70 years. What exactly, explain to our viewers, do you mean, or does Humza Yousaf mean, by progressive taxation?
Well, the report from the Institute of Fiscal Studies is very clear that actually Scotland has the most progressive tax and benefit system in the UK. Well, people at the lower end pay less tax, people at the higher end pay more tax than those south of the border. But what that results in is the lower tenth, when you put tax and benefit together, gain about £600 a year, which is almost 5% uplift in income. The people in the top 10% end up paying about £2,500 more. But that's an increase of 2.1. And in exchange for that, if their kids are at university, they're not paying tuition fees. If their parents need home care, they're not paying social care costs, etc.
Is it fair, though, that middle earners in Scotland would be picking up even more of the tab?
Well, I think, you know, describing 75 to 125,000 as middle earners, I mean, that's actually quite well off. I'm in there and I wouldn't begrudge paying more tax. The problem is that the Scottish Government only have powers over less than a third of taxation. And income tax is a limited, blunt tool.
You haven't used it, but you haven't used it very often, have you? I mean, in terms of bearing taxes, it hasn't been something the SNP government...
We've been using it since 2016. But the problem is they don't control inheritance tax, capital gains tax, dividend tax. And of course, the higher you put income tax, the more you may drive people into that. And that's the problem. We don't control taxation.
Do you disagree with any of what you've just heard there from Philippa Whitford?
I mean, we don't know what the exact plans are, but you know, those with the broader shoulders should pay more. And that's a principle that, you know, I've always believed in, and that's something that my party firmly believes in.
Right, so you share the sort of broad sentiment and principle that Philippa Whitford has set out, and what is being implied by Humza Yousaf?
It's been a broad principle of the Labour Party for as long as I can remember, so that those with the broader shoulders should pay more.
So why has Keir Starmer decided to drop his campaign pledge to increase taxes, income taxes, on the top 5% of earners?
So I think we went through this last time I was on that. Keir has
I'm so sorry if we did that last time.
No. It's just, Keir has dropped some of his pledges because things change. So the principles remain the same, but policies I would expect to change. We've had a pandemic, we've had fluctuations in government, so of course things are going to change. And we've been very clear that we'd set out our tax plans in advance of the next general election. But in the meantime, we've said we'd scrap non-dom status, we've said we'd introduce a windfall tax.
Right. I mean, those are relatively minor in terms of the sort of income it might save or generate. Alex Shelburne, what do you think? You are probably critical of Rishi Sunak in terms of the tax burden. Would you like to see tax cuts?
I'd certainly like to see the economy stimulated through reducing taxation on business. I understand why the Prime Minister's taken the route he has. But, I mean, he himself has said that he hopes this is a temporary thing. But I think that it's a conversation in the government to how quickly can we start to reduce that burden on business. It's the opposite conversation elsewhere of how can we increase the tax burden. And I think that this is one of the fundamental problems, because if we don't create the circumstances for businesses to grow and create more profit, then all we'll do, because we are going to spend more money, an ageing population, etc., we're going to spend more money. We're just going to have to keep increasing taxes. And, of course, we borrowed $138 billion last year. So, I mean, we're not even balancing the books.
Is income tax too high at the moment?
Well, I mean, as we saw, there is no great demand to cut the income tax rates. Of course, this government did cut the 45p threshold by 30 grand down. But I think, for my focus, it's about taxes on business. They're the ones who generate the income. They're the ones who are going to ultimately get more revenue in for the government and ultimately, hopefully, reduce taxation in other areas for people. But the fundamental taxes for me, which have to come down first, is that on business, so that it can be reinvested into business, reinvested into people's wages and ease the burden in that sense.
Philippa?
Well, the thing is, actually, business depends also on public services. It depends on the health service for their workers. It depends on decent roads and rail. And actually, you need governments to invest in infrastructure, whether physical or digital. That also stimulates business. And the problem that we saw with the last 13 years of austerity is it might look good in the Treasury balance sheets, but actually what it leads to is less spending by people in local economies, boarded up high streets, and therefore fewer people being employed because people don't have money to go out and spend.
But I wouldn't want the picture painted that there's been no infrastructure. I mean, Boris Johnson said as one of his key planks to increase super-fast broadband, and he's taken that from 8% to 75% rollout across the country. So there is significant infrastructure for businesses going in. But where I do agree with Philippa... No, absolutely, because, I mean, obviously there's still 25% there. Oh, I disagree when I look around my own city of Leeds. But the reality is that Philippa just outlined about needing more money for public services. That increase is going to keep growing in how the demands come.
And should that go on those who earn the most?
But it's not about who earns the most. It's about where you can get the most income from. You can get the most income from businesses being able to invest and generate more profits that the corporation tax then covers off. So how do you stimulate business to do that?
Or you can also tax wealth and land instead of just income, which
we'll come on to wealth
sidled away somewhere else.
But do you think Alex has heard of patriotic millionaires, a group of very wealthy people who are saying to the government on a regular basis, there's lots of wealth here, it's just where it's held is the problem. And that's the Tories in a nutshell, isn't it? They're not prepared to redistribute money in a fair way, in a decent way, even when very rich people are telling them to do so.
Right. I mean, but as I say, Keir Starmer isn't prepared to put up taxes. You want to tackle poverty. That is something that you have talked an awful lot about. What about the issue of wealth taxes?
We haven't said we're not prepared to. We have said we will set out our tax plans in advance of the next general election.
This is going to be one of the key battlegrounds, isn't it, at the next election? Difficult for all the parties.
100% key battleground. I mean, tax is sky high. My readers, your viewers are clobbered with the highest rate of tax since post-war. Meanwhile, public services are still feeling pretty squeezed. The economy is stagnant at best. And what we desperately need to do is try and have some vision for some ideas for how to kickstart that economic growth. I do wonder how much tax is too much tax for the SNP, because it starts to sound like no amount of tax will be too much tax, because you just fundamentally believe the state is better off spending that money than the individual. And I think that's where probably your politics and my paper's politics differ.
Well, that's not the point. I made the point that that's the only tax that they get to control in Scotland that relates to income or wealth. And I pointed out that actually income tax is a blunt tool, because exactly if you start to go too high, people can stash it in pockets that the Scottish Government can't tax. And that's why you have to look at things like wealth and land, but we don't control those taxes.
Would you like Labour to look at the issue of wealth taxes? Taxes on capital rather than on earnings?
I would like us to look at wealth taxes and their conversations I'm having with our front bench. You know, at the end of the day, I'm a backbencher.
I know.
You know, I'm not setting this policy, but I can try and influence where I can. And all I know is that if you look through history, every single Labour government makes sure that there's fairness injected into the system. At the minute, it's not fair. And I can guarantee that last time we pulled people out of poverty, we'll do it again.
But can I just ask, what is a land tax? You keep talking about land tax. What is the land tax? What is your aim on that?
Well, I mean, I'm in the wrong parliament, Alec. I'm down here with you. I'm not in Holyrood. But basically, these are things that we should be looking at because people can hoard money in property, in land, and it doesn't get taxed. It's mostly on income, and we're not hitting people enough with capital gains and other things when they're selling and dealing in property.
What about farming? Because, I mean, in the early 90s, 0% inheritance tax put on farms, which allowed family farms to stay within and not lose them being broken up through inheritance tax. Is that what we're talking about with the land tax?
Well, obviously, you look at the policy in detail. I'm not going to try and create SNP policy here, but what I'm saying is income tax, which is the main one that the Scottish Government have control over, is limited. Down here, the UK government have control of all the other taxes and they're not using them to be fairer, and constantly using it as an excuse to go back to austerity actually strangles local economies, and then you get less tax return.
You were shaking your head as Joanna was talking about increasing wealth taxes, perhaps equalising capital gains tax with income tax rates and thresholds. What would your readers think about that?
I just think that anybody going into a next election saying let's raise taxes even higher, let's create new forms of taxation, is probably going to be met by a lot of disappointment on the doorstep. People already feel very overtaxed. They pay a lot on their housing, on their income, and they just can't afford to pay more. That's how they feel. That's how my readers feel.
And yet, broader shoulders should be paying it.
And a lot of people in polls actually suggest they would rather see more taxation if they're in that higher group so that they can rely on public services rather than having to replace them by paying privately.
All right, we're going to move on, talk about a different story. Let me just show you this headline. MP Joanna Cherry threatens legal action over cancelled show. This is reporting that the SNP's Joanna Cherry may take some legal recourse against the Stand Comedy Club in Edinburgh after the venue cancelled a fringe show she was due to appear in this summer. Joanna Cherry is a vocal critic of her own government's plans to make it easier for people in Scotland to change their legally recognised sex. You'll remember that those plans were blocked by the UK government back in January. We discussed it on the programme. The Stand said they cancelled the show with Joanna Cherry because key operational staff were unwilling to work on the event and the venue wanted to respect their views. Joanna Cherry, thank you for joining us. She's in Parliament's Central Lobby. What are you going to do? Just let's check we can hear you. Just speak again.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can, Joanna. Go ahead.
Good. Well, just to be very clear, Jo, the Stand invited me to take part in one of a series of their events of In Conversation shows with politicians at the beginning of the year, and I agreed to do so. Subsequently, they've told me that I'm no longer welcome at their venue because their staff objects to my views on self-identification.
Yes.
So that's basically what's happened in a nutshell.
And what are you going to do about it?
Well, I have instructed solicitors and an opinion from senior counsel, one of the most distinguished KCs, I should say, in Scotland and England, Aidan O'Neill, with whom I worked previously on the prorogation case, and Aidan has given a very robust opinion that I have a strong case against the Stand for unlawfully discriminating against me on the basis of my gender-critical beliefs. A case in England taken by a friend of mine called Maya Forstater has established that gender-critical beliefs are philosophical beliefs that are protected under the protected characteristic of religion or belief in the Equality Act. So just in the same way that the Stand staff would be unlawfully discriminating against me if they refuse to work with me because I'm a lesbian or because I'm a Catholic, it is also unlawful for them to refuse to work with me because I hold gender-critical beliefs. So I believe I have a very strong case against the Stand, but I've written to them, this isn't about money, it's about the principle. Yes. And I've written to them in the hope that this can be sorted without me needing to take legal action.
OK, so you're waiting to make that final decision, but you think you have a strong case. I'm just going to read for our guests and viewers the statement released by by the stand. It says a number of the stand's key operational staff, including venue management and box office personnel, are unwilling to work on this event. We will ensure that their views are respected. We will not compel our staff to work on this event, and so have concluded that the event is unable to proceed on a properly staffed basis. What's your response to that?
Well, they also used, you've left out what they said at the end, they said it also couldn't proceed on a legally compliant basis. I'm not really quite sure what they mean by that. Are they suggesting that in some way, as a gender-critical lesbian feminist, my views are unlawful? If that's their position, then as well as being incorrect in law, it's actually grossly defamatory of me.
Right.
As I said, I don't want to have to go to court over this. What I want the stand to do is to apologise for their unlawful discrimination and to reinstate the event. Now, there are many other women across Scotland and the United Kingdom who are being discriminated against on the same basis as me because they don't agree with self-identification and because, like me, they don't believe lesbians have penises and they don't believe a man can become a woman simply by saying that he is. And I'm aware of many women who are losing jobs, losing contracts and losing the means to earn a livelihood because of this discrimination. So I think it's very important that for somebody like me who has the privilege of being a public figure to take a stand against this unlawful discrimination, not just for my sake, but also for the sake of other women and indeed some men.
Well, hang on, Joanne. Let me bring in the others. That's very clear. You're making a stand, as you say. You're using your platform to actually stand up for the rights of women like you. Do you think Joanna Cherry's right to take the action, if indeed she does in the end, if it can't be resolved, on the basis of what she said, Philippa?
Well, obviously, I would hope it wouldn't come to legal action.
Course,
I think legal action never really is a great gain for anybody.
But are you sympathetic to what you've just heard?
Well, I mean, as I was clear publicly, I mean, Joanna and I disagree on the issue of self-ID and the Gender Reform Act, but equally, I find it really sad that this entire debate has become so polarised and negative. And this was not an event around transgender. Joanna, as she said, was invited. This is an interview with her. So this might have been a small part of that. It was not the aim of the show. And I do find it disappointing when debates are shut down, regardless of
So do you think the
views.
stand should reinstate the invitation to Joanna Cherry, whatever her views, from a freedom of speech argument? You do?
Yeah.
Right, so you think the stand is in the wrong in this space. I mean, Joanna, support for the SNP has declined a bit over the last few months, according to the polls. We had Alex Salmond, the former SNP leader, now Alba, on this programme recently. He was arguing that a big reason for that, in his mind, was this debate on gender identity. Do you agree?
Well, I think it's certainly contributed to a drop in the polls for us. The opinion polls are very clear that the party has not taken, and the Parliament has not taken the public with it on the issue of self-ID. Now, I want to make it absolutely crystal clear, Jo, that I support trans rights. I'm a human rights lawyer. I'm a lesbian who's been out since the 80s and has actively campaigned for equal rights my whole life. I support equal rights. What I don't support is the right of any man to self-identify as a woman without safeguards, and opinion polls show that the majority of the Scottish public agree with me, and I can tell you from the huge amount of support I've received, not just in recent days but in recent months, that I know I have public opinion on my side on this. But even if I didn't, I would be taking this stand. As I say, not just for myself, but for the other women who are being discriminated against on this basis.
Philippa, do you agree with Joanna that actually that is probably part of the reason, as Alex Salmond has said, that support has declined, because you haven't taken the public in Scotland with you over the Gender Recognition Reform Act?
I think it may be one of the contributors, but actually that debate was happening for a long time before the recent fall in the polls. But where I would agree with Joanna is, I think on both sides what we've ended up with is a very negative debate, and therefore it's actually very hard to debate and discuss in public what the minutiae of it are. But this is not Scotland losing its mind, which is how it's painted down here. This was the advice from the Council of Europe in 2015, our neighbouring EU countries, Ireland in 2015, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, they all have a self-ID based
system. But why is it a negative debate? Why is it negative for Joanna to be able to set out her views as she has?
No, I don't mean Joanna setting out her views, but early on, what we had was people on both sides of the debate being very aggressive. And if you tried to engage in that debate, and of course, social media is not the place for a nuanced debate like this. What you end up with is an axe in both sides of your neck, and that is something I've experienced.
Right, but do you think not you personally, but the SNP have contributed to that polarisation?
I think that having, you know, the kind of equal marriage, etc., the progress that's been made around the recognition of the gay community, the LGBT community over recent years, I think the Scottish Government probably underestimated the reaction there would be and didn't maybe do enough early on to really be setting out what this was and what it wasn't.
I mean, Joanna, we should say the Stand Comedy Club that you are in dispute with at the moment used to be owned by Tommy Shepherd, SNP MP. I think he's still a director. Just to sort of set, if you like, some context for it. What do you think of Philippa saying that actually they should resolve this, the Stand Comedy Club, and re-invite you?
I wish more politicians had the courage of Philippa in saying what's really quite simple to say, and what I was delighted to hear Stephen Flynn, leader of the Westminster Group, say on the radio yesterday, which is this: I don't expect people to agree with my views on gender self-ID. What I do expect people to do is to respect my views, to hold them, and to allow me to articulate them. Now, Philippa says that the debate has been nasty on both sides. I dispute that. I defy Philippa to give me an example of a trans rights activist who has been threatened with rape or death, as I have, and I've been to court in respect of both, and because of my views on this.
Joanna,
many women have been assaulted and lost their jobs. I don't think that's happened to any of the trans rights activists.
I'm going to interject just for a moment because I want to welcome viewers on BBC News as we are just under 10 minutes away from Prime Minister's questions, the first PMQ since those local election results. We are talking with our guests at the moment about the Gender Recognition Reform Bill in Scotland, a particular case with the SNP MP Joanna Cherry, who is in dispute with a club who has resolved to take away the invitation for her to come and speak. You think, Joanna, because of your views when it comes to gender issues.
I think that is a fact. That's why they've done it. They say that their staff don't feel comfortable with my views. Now, if the staff said they didn't feel comfortable because I'm a lesbian or because I'm a Catholic, that would be a very clear case of discrimination. The law says it's also discriminatory for them to say they don't feel comfortable with me because of my gender-critical views. My rights as a feminist and my rights as a citizen of the United Kingdom to free speech are not dependent on me accepting gender identity ideology or self-identification. That's quite simply a matter of law.
All right. Philippa, final word?
Well, in what sense? I've already said that I hope they do re-establish the invitation. I totally recognise Joanna's right to hold a totally different view from me, but I have certainly experienced not being threatened with rape, but certainly very negative attacks on me within social media and emails. So the debate has been negative on both sides, and I think the Scottish Government, right at the start, probably thought this was a straightforward expansion of rights to another minority community and didn't maybe spend enough effort in explaining what it was and what it wasn't. But don't forget, 2/3 of MSPs, MSPs from all parties in Scotland, supported this legislation in the end.
Where do you stand on this? Because it's true, the sort of front bench, if you like, in Holyrood for the Labour Party did support it, and some Conservative MSPs too. And yet Keir Starmer hasn't been absolutely clear as to whether he supports the action by Rishi Sunak, by the government, to block this on the basis of discrimination or inequality across the border. Where are you?
Well, I would say I'm largely where Joanna is, to be honest. And I think, you know, this is difficult because, you know, I believe in free speech, but also a venue has a duty of care over their staff, don't they? What do they do if people refuse to come into work? It's like this whole debate, it's not cut and dry. You know, I don't believe that somebody should get up one morning and wander into a women's changing room and say, you know, I am no longer a man, I'm a woman today. But I also have a lot of friends who are transgender who've went through absolute hell and pain just to be who they want to be. So it's not cut and dry. It's not something that can be ground down to finite yes and no answers. And I think that's the problem. It's become so toxic, the entire debate.
But the gender reform is not that you can just get up in the morning and do what you like. It's a statutory process that still takes time and is a legal process. And if it is fraudulent, you can still go to prison for 2 years.
But it's
exactly that narrative, as if someone can be a woman on a Saturday and back to being a man in a suit on a Monday.
We're going to leave it there.
That is not what it is.
Thank you very much, Joanna Cherry, for joining us. As we said earlier on in the programme, the small boats, illegal migration bill, piece of legislation being proposed by the government, is in the House of Lords for the first time today. And there's going to be a lot of criticism, we've been told. Lords lining up to criticise the content of that bill, which is to detain people. In fact, there is the Archbishop of Canterbury. We can see him there, Justin Welby, on his feet now, and we will try and bring you a little bit of what he says later on in the programme. But we know he's going to be critical. What's your message to Lords who are against the bill, Alec?
I think actually it's more interesting that there appears to be a motion that can shut the whole thing down. I've forgotten what the wording is. In the Lords, but Labour have said they're not going to.
No, it's unsure.
That.
This, I think, is from Brian Paddock, former Commissioner, Liberal Democrat, I think, peer, who has put forward this motion, but it's not going to get Labour support from what we've heard. But generally, about the wealth of opposition to this bill, which is so key to the government's plans.
But how much opposition is there if you're not actually going to take that vote and
well,
kill
they
it? I
can
don't
still
think
amend
they
the
should,
bill. Well, they can
because
still
I think the bill is an important part of trying to sort out an issue. And I'm afraid I have a problem with where the Church of England stand on this because they did not make available some of their large vicarages which were empty when we were looking for homes for the Afghan asylum seekers, the refugees.
So you think they're being hypocritical?
I do think they're being hypocritical, and I think it was hypocritical to say that they have to maximise the income of things and then turn around and say the government aren't doing things. So that's not to disparage the conversations that may take place there. And I think the Lords always have an important role to look at it carefully and perhaps suggest amendments, but I find it sticks in the claw to make out that the Church of England is all-caring, all-encompassing when they had several vicarages that they could have used and decided not to. And I think that's wrong.
Kate, how difficult is this going to be, do you think? Opposition, yes, in the Lords, but there could be amendments. The bill could be changed. How worried do you think ministers are?
I think that they are braced for the Lords to try and tear this bill to shreds. They've said as much to me. But I think they're feeling pretty confident about this bill in the Commons and public support for this bill. The polls show that there's huge public support for getting a grip on the Channel boats migrant crisis. People want to see those claims processed way quicker. I mean, it's taking years currently. I think the point that Alec makes is actually a good point, because you can't have your cake and eat it. You are having these numbers arrive. Do you want to house them in hotels? Does Scotland want to house them in hotels? It costs lots of money. You have to have them in rural communities. My understanding is that the SNP government's been very reluctant to do that. Well, you know, these people have to go somewhere if you're happy to have these numbers arrive. If not, you're probably looking at quite radical policies to try and cut these numbers. And that is, I'm afraid, the difficult nature of the problem.
Let's have a listen to Justin Welby, his opening remarks.
My Lords, we need a bill to reform migration. We need a bill to stop the boats. We need a bill to destroy the evil tribe of traffickers. The tragedy is that without much change, this is not that bill.
You say it's hypocritical. Do you think ministers will take notice of what Justin Welby said, or at least the public watching?
Well, let's wait and see if he comes up with any plausible alternatives. And you know, I mean, for all of the criticism people have of the bill, what alternative have they come up with? One thing I would like to see, but there are safe and legal routes, Philippa. In lots of ways, we take tens of thousands of refugees in every single year. We have not just shut the borders of Britain and said nobody can come in. That is simply incorrect. But the reality is that no one comes up with an alternative. One thing I would like to see is put what happens in the Justice Department into the Home Office and take all immigration, visas, passports out into its own separate department, and that might address the issues Kate has raised.
Well, let's have a look at the alternative. What are the alternatives?
I mean, the reason we're talking about barges and churches and elsewhere is because of the backlog that was created under the Tory government. They failed to process asylum applications properly.
John Reid, 17 years ago, said it wasn't fit for purpose.
Well, I'm not talking about 17 years ago. I'm talking about
successive governments.
No, the numbers are at a record high.
Yeah, but it's successive governments have had this problem because it's not being processed by the civil service.
You've done nothing to deal with that. Instead, you keep coming up with gimmick after gimmick, putting people in old military bases, putting them in churches, putting them on barges. Well, what you would be better off doing is investing that money into processing claims.
Well, I think the government has said it would, but what would you do to break up the people smuggling business?
Well, it's about having proper agreements, isn't it, with France and other European countries. And again, the government being quite belligerent in those discussions, and that's why we haven't got anywhere.
Right, and if you had more safe and legal routes, as Philippa was suggesting, there are some, would you have them from everywhere? Would you have it from Eritrea? Would you have it from...
The problem at the moment is that obviously there's been a huge welcoming of people from Ukraine, and Scotland has actually taken way above its population area. Hong Kong, very limited from Afghanistan. But if you are a young person in sub-Saharan Africa being persecuted for your political views, your religion, your sexuality, there is no safe and legal route.
So you would like routes
claim
there?
Asylum until you put foot on soil, and that is what you need to change.
Just briefly, since we're coming up to midday, in fact, we're almost there, we will have Oscar Bentley from the Political Research Unit for the BBC listening out for any statistics claims made that need a little more investigation. We'll speak to you after Prime Minister's questions. The government has said it would look at more safe and legal routes as part of this bill. Would you support that?
I don't rule anything out. I think this is a wide and wide-reaching issue. What I would say is, I think this conversation, again, does a disservice to some of the deals done. The French stopped 60% last year. Now, put that into context, we'd be in the six-figure sums if the French weren't doing what they were doing. And is there no safe and legal route into the EU?
Let's go for a safe and legal route into the House of Commons.
This morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Clive Lewis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 years ago, I raised the case of a Norwich Army veteran. In such agony, he was forced to pull out 18 of his own teeth because he couldn't get access to a dentist. The grim fact is, despite repeated promises from the Prime Minister, Norwich and Norfolk remain dental deserts. So, Mr. Speaker, dentists excel at extracting rotten teeth. So will the Prime Minister agree with me? The only way my constituents will see results is when this rotten government is extracted from office and replaced with a Labour one.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very sorry to hear about the honourable gentleman's constituent. With regard to dentistry, he'll know there are record sums going into dentistry and indeed 500 more NHS dentists working today. Because of the contract reforms that we've put in place, 10% more activity can happen, and DHSE are currently talking about reforming the dentistry contract with the presidents in practice to increase activity further.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent Gordon, unfortunately, has been receiving cancer treatment at the Mount Vernon Hospital, which will soon fall within Sadiq Khan's new ULEZ boundaries. As Gordon continues his daily treatment, he will now be expected to pay £12.50 a charge or buy a new compliant vehicle. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the British people already have enough on without Labour's London Mayor stretching household budgets further, just so he can cover his mismanagement of TfL finances?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry to hear of my honourable friend's constituent Gordon, and I send him my best wishes. He will know that transport in London is devolved to the Labour Mayor, who is expanding the zone against the overwhelming views of residents and businesses. And what's more, his plan to raise costs for hard-working families is totally backed by the Leader of the Opposition. Perhaps he can now tell us why.
I don't think he's responsible for the questions. We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank all those who took part in the coronation celebrations over the weekend? And can I also take this chance to wish all the very best to my brilliant and talented constituent, May Muller, who is representing the UK at Eurovision in Liverpool this weekend. The whole country is behind you, May. Now, Mr. Speaker, this time last week, the Prime Minister had to correct the record on misleading claims he made about employment numbers. Can he provide a further update? Now he's cost 1,000 Tory councillors their jobs.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me pass on my best wishes to May as well for this weekend Eurovision. With regard to the local elections, Mr. Speaker, maybe I can just offer the honourable gentleman a tiny bit of advice from one of his predecessors. One of his predecessors, Tony Blair, who I was reading the other day. What did Tony Blair? He said the right honourable gentleman can be as cocky as he likes about the local elections. Come a general election, policy counts. And we know, Mr. Speaker, the problem for him is he doesn't have any.
The Prime Minister said he was going to lose 1,000 seats, and then he managed it. After 13 years, a Tory promise they actually haven't broken. And this is the Prime Minister who's only had to fight for two things in his life. Last year, he lost a Tory beauty contest to the member for South West Norfolk, who then lost to a lettuce. Last week, when he finally came into contact with voters, he lost everywhere. No matter who the electorate is, the Prime Minister keeps entering a two-horse race and somehow finishing third. Given his track record, who does he think he's actually got a mandate from?
Mr. Speaker, it's a bit rich to hear about mandates from the person who's broken every single promise he was elected on. I mean, go through the list, Mr. Speaker. Nationalisations, NHS outsourcing, universal credit, and now tuition fees. Mr. Speaker, he was for them all before he was against them. He's not just the softie, he's the flaky too.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can understand why the Prime Minister's trying to wish away his terrible results, but peddling nonsense just doesn't work. Up and down the country, people want the government to focus on the cost of living, but he's got no answers. Is he planning to carry on as if nothing happened and ignore the message he was sent last week? Or is he going to do what a Labour government would do and announce an immediate freeze in council tax bills?
Mr. Speaker, I know he's asked his Labour councillors rightly to focus on the cost of living. Perhaps they could start with reducing council tax to the level in Conservative-run areas. But, Mr. Speaker, we're getting on with halving people's energy bills, freezing fuel duty to help them with the cost of living. What is stopping him having a plan is that, unfortunately, his shadow chancellor recently said she's discovered she's got a problem, Mr. Speaker. She realised that she actually, this is what she said, she actually has to, shock horror, say where the money's going to come from. With a £90 billion black hole in her plans, she's got a lot of work to do.
Mr. Speaker, there's only one party that broke the economy, and they're sitting right there. And it seems to me, to quote one of his more electorally successful predecessors, nothing has changed. Still blaming other people, still refusing to take the necessary action, still not listening to the country. And on council tax, it's quite simple. A Labour government would give every council the grant they need to freeze those bills, fully paid for by ending the handouts he's giving to oil and gas giants. So I ask him again, now his plan has been utterly rejected, why won't he do the same?
Mr. Speaker, just a quick history lesson. While he was busy softening sentences 13 years ago, let me just remind him what we inherited. It was the largest deficit in the G7 from Labour. Higher unemployment. The coffers were totally empty. And it didn't stop there, Mr. Speaker. After that, they wanted a longer lockdown. And now, they won't even oppose the picketers and the protesters, Mr. Speaker. Even in opposition, they're damaging the economy.
He's just not listening, is he? Even after the entire country, Mr. Speaker, from the Peak District to the Garden of England, rejected his government last week, he still thinks that protecting oil and gas profits is more important than freezing bills. Now, I'm sure the Prime Minister must finally have met some working people in recent weeks. Did any of them understand why he insists on protecting his precious non-dom tax status rather than scrapping it and using the money to train thousands of doctors and nurses?
Well, Mr. Speaker, he said that this money would fund the NHS workforce, but that plan was actually looked at by one of his own colleagues recently. Now that person said that it would discourage doctors and nurses from coming here, and that there was a £2 billion shortfall in his sums. Who said that? It was Alistair Darling. He might remember those days. It's when Labour bankrupted the economy.
I think that is the definition of nonsense. And this is the price of having a tired, worn-out government fronted by a Prime Minister who boasts he's never had a working-class friend. He's smiling his way through the cost of living crisis, gloating about success while waiting lists grow. He's pretending that crime, house building, schools are all just doing fine, while handing the country 24 tax rises, all with his name on them. How does he think the Tories can possibly provide the answers Britain needs when the whole country has already told him they're the problem, not the solution?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is right. We all do say some silly things when we're younger. I was a teenager, and he'll know what I'm talking about, because I think in his 40s he was still talking about abolishing the monarchy, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
But it's the same old guff from him every week, Mr. Speaker. All politics and no action. We're getting on with halving people's energy bills, freezing fuel duty, cutting the costs of childcare, and boosting pay. While he's busy plotting coalitions, we're getting on and delivering for the British people.
Mr. Speaker, this Saturday is Surrey Day, a chance for locals and visitors to celebrate everything wonderful about our county, including our beautiful historic High Street in Guildford with its independent shops. But frequently raised with me is empty shops. High rents with high business rates makes it difficult for independent retailers to compete with national chains. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that this government must do everything it can to support our high streets as part of our plan to boost economic growth?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right about the importance of high streets for local communities, not just in Surrey but around the country. That's why we are abolishing business rates for hundreds of thousands of eligible businesses in the retail, hospitality and leisure sector, and investing billions of pounds through the High Streets Fund and our Towns Fund to support local communities up and down the country.
SNP spokesperson Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Prime Minister was to go to the boot of his Land Rover and pull out some placards which said "Save our nom-doms," would he expect to be arrested by the police?
Mr. Speaker, can I first put on record my thanks to the police for all their hard work over the weekend, ensuring that the coronation was a success. Now, look, on this issue, Mr. Speaker, we believe the police should have powers to make sure that they can protect the public from unnecessary and serious disruption. I respectfully recognise that the honourable gentleman disagrees with our position. I guess the question for both of us is, what does the honourable leader of the opposition think about this? Because it's quite hard to keep up.
Can I just remind the Prime Minister, it's Prime Minister's questions for him to answer, not asking, not for what the opposition's doing. Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, what we're talking about here is that nurses strike, doctors strike, firefighters strike, protest, firefighters protest, and of course Republicans protest as well. And they do so because it's a fundamental right within our democracy to be able to protest. So is the Prime Minister seriously saying that moving forward you can have your rights, but only on his terms?
Mr. Speaker, it is also the right of the British public to be able to go about their ordinary day-to-day lives without undue serious disruption. That's why it's right that the police have extra powers. I respect that the honourable gentleman disagrees with that, but we think it is right, and people will see every day, on TV, their lives being disrupted. They're not able to get to school, to get to hospital appointments, and indeed to get to work. They should be able to do that, and the police should have powers to stop those who are preventing that from happening.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It was an honour to welcome the Australian Prime Minister to Barrow last week so he could meet some of our fantastic apprentices, see the submarine programme and reaffirm his commitment to the AUKUS programme that will deliver thousands of jobs in my constituency and keep our nation safe. But what was a national endeavour is now an international one, and it's going to require a whole-of-government approach to get it over the line and deliver it well. So with that in mind, could I invite my right honourable friend to Barrow to see the programme for himself, and also to meet with me to see how we can best leverage the opportunities from this for the people of Barrow for generations to come?
Well, my honourable friend is a fantastic advocate for his local industry and community, and he's right, the SSN AUKUS submarines will be built in Barrow, the home of the British submarine industry. It will create thousands of new jobs, not just in Barrow, but across the UK. That's why the government is investing billions to modernise the enterprise, and I look forward to taking him up on his invitation.
And David.
Mr. Speaker, last week many lifelong Conservative voters turned to the Liberal Democrats to be their strong local champions. They delivered their verdict on the government's failure to hold water companies to account for dumping raw sewage into our rivers and onto our beaches. Last year, water bosses were paid £15 million in bonuses, rewarded for destroying our precious natural environment. 3 of those executives have now turned down their bonuses, but they should never have been entitled to them in the first place. So will the Prime Minister ban these sewage bonuses so that the dumping actually stops?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I struggle to hear the full question, but I think in one sense it doesn't really matter, because we all know the Liberal Democrats say one thing here and another thing locally anyway. And it is remarkable. No wonder he's attracted to the Labour leader these days, Mr. Speaker. Political opportunism and a broken promise on tuition fees. It must be like looking in the mirror.
Ben Bradley.
To highlight some success with Mansfield District Council now having more Conservative councillors than at any point in my lifetime after last week's local elections. I'm very proud of our local team. But one thing we heard on the doorstep was frustration. A frustration and expectation that government needs to deliver on key pledges. There has been a commitment to our part of the world that we'll be given the clout, the investment to catch up with other regions that historically have had more than we've had. So will the Prime Minister take the opportunity to reiterate his commitment and to my constituents reassure them that he will support growth and investment in the East Midlands?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is a tireless advocate for the East Midlands, and in particular, I welcome the devolution deal that has been agreed among the 4 local authorities in the region, something I know my honourable friend has campaigned for. And like him, I look forward to those new devolved institutions being established as soon as possible to drive economic growth in his community.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has previously declared, and I quote, "My daughter is the climate change champion in our house." I wonder if he's asked her what she thinks about Rosebank, the biggest undeveloped oil field in the North Sea, which would blow climate targets, create more emissions than 28 of the world's poorest countries combined, involve the obscene transfer of £4 billion of taxpayers' money to a Norwegian energy firm, Equinor, and do nothing for energy security since the vast majority of the oil will be exported. If he gives it the green light, will he be able to look his daughter in the eye and honestly say that he has done everything in his power to give her and all other young people a livable future?
Mr. Speaker, as the Independent Committee for Climate Change has acknowledged, we will need fossil fuels for the next few decades as we transition to a greener future. And during that period, it makes absolutely no sense to not invest in the resources we have here at home, to import foreign fossil fuels, not create jobs here, and import them at twice the carbon emissions as our local resources. It is an economically illiterate policy, Mr. Speaker, but that's what you'd expect from the Green Party.
George Eustace. George Eustace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last June, the government committed to bring forward a horticulture strategy to identify ways to expand British production of horticulture. And the importance of this was underlined by some of the supply chain challenges we saw earlier this spring. But in the last week, there's been speculation that the government might be abandoning that strategy. Can the Prime Minister give us any reassurance that the government remains committed to expanding this important British industry?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank my right honourable friend for all of his work championing this area. We are delivering for the horticulture sector, and it will benefit from the £168 million investment to drive innovation and support food production. And that's why we also passed the new Genetic Technology Act, Mr. Speaker, taking advantage of our Brexit opportunities to unlock the potential of new technologies. But I look forward to discussing this and other ideas at our new upcoming Food Summit.
Julie Elliott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Has the Prime Minister or any of his ministers given commitments to BP, Equinor or any other company about contracts at the Teesworks site?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, contracts at the site would be a commercial matter for the companies involved.
Mr. Speaker, our farmers provide our food and our countryside's future. But there's concern among some Oxfordshire farmers that the new schemes under DEFRA's agricultural transition plan aren't ready for farmers to access them to make up the shortfall from the basic payment scheme. Will my right honourable friend push his colleagues in DEFRA to roll out the rest of the SFI standards as soon as possible and to consider double stacking SFI and countryside stewardship payments to ensure that Oxfordshire's farmers get the support they need?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his question, and of course we want to make sure that we continue to support farmers to produce healthy, nutritious food. We are pressing ahead with the ELM scheme, fine-tuning them though to make sure that they work even better for farmers. We want to make sure there's enough flexibility in the sustainable farming initiatives, and that's why DEFRA have designed the schemes with farmers in mind, enabling them to do more and to make sure that they can use countryside stewardship schemes on the same plots of land. But I look forward to discussing this with him and other colleagues as well.
Alan Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Stirling, we've got a really potentially very exciting development at Forthside on former Ministry of Defence land. And sadly, the development's got a bit stuck over a dispute about the costs of the decontamination of that land. Now, I'll work with anybody to get a result for Stirling. Will the Prime Minister meet with me and representatives of Stirling Council to get this development unblocked and make the progress we all want to see?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have invested in Stirling previously to unlock investment and drive growth, and I'll ensure that the honourable gentleman gets the meeting he needs with the relevant minister to make progress.
Mark Warburton.
The Prime Minister and I share a profound optimism about the power of technology, and AI in particular has the power to revolutionise public services and our private sector as well. But does he agree with me that it comes with risks? And while there are unrealistic calls to pause research into it altogether, it is crucial for us to work with our allies around the world so that the global norms that emerge in this important area reflect our values.
Well, my honourable friend speaks with experience and knowledge on this issue, and I absolutely agree with the thrust of his question. Whilst it would be implausible and wrong to halt the development of this technology, it is right that we ensure that there are appropriate guardrails in place as we look to exploit its opportunities. Those are the conversations we are having, not just with the companies involved, but also with our allies around the world, and he can expect further progress in the coming weeks and months.
Mike Nolly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following on from his earlier answer, as the Prime Minister knows, an Eat Out to Help Out scheme was introduced in August 2020, which increased demand for eating in restaurants by some 216% compared to 2019, with figures now showing that over 17,500 retail chain stores closed in 2020 alone, affecting nearly 35,000 employees. Would or has the Prime Minister considered a similar scheme for bricks and mortar retail, bricks versus clicks, if you like, as part of the wider plan for regenerating local high streets and town centres?
Well,
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the way that we are supporting high streets and town centres is through making sure that we cut business rates in England. Obviously, the Scottish Government will receive Barnett consequentials from those actions, but now hundreds of thousands of local businesses on our high streets don't pay any business rates at all. And on top of that, through the Levelling Up Fund, Towns Fund and others, we're investing directly in local communities. Indeed, in his own, where I know council leaders described our investment of £19 million as very welcome and a real boost for the economic recovery.
Maggie through.
Mr. Speaker, my original friend recently scored a very rare own goal by backing Stockton Football Club in the Northern Premier League East Playoff Final, which eventually saw Long Eaton United win on penalties. In the interest of good sportsmanship, will he now congratulate Ian Deakin and his team on their resounding victory, wish Long Eaton United every success in the league for next season, and join me at Grange Park to cheer on Long Eaton United for the next season and wish them luck every season in the future.
Yeah, well, Mr. Speaker, can I join my honourable friend in congratulating her local football team and all involved in their stunning success. I'm not sure if I'll be able to join her in the immediate future, but I do look forward to seeing them go from strength to strength, much as the fortunes of my own team, sadly, are not in the place I would like them to be.
Jamie Stone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister may well have seen the astonishing sight of a former Scottish Government Minister standing up in the Chamber of Scottish Parliament and tearing up, literally ripping into pieces, the Scottish Government's highly protected marine area proposal. This proposal is deeply controversial all over Scotland and has even led to it being compared with his second Highland clearances. Is this not now the time? Is this not now the time for the UK Government to step in and work with the devolved...
There you have it.
Mr. Speaker, I will not be silenced, because it matters... This matters deeply to my constituents. Deeply. Is it not time for the UK Government to step in, work with the devolved administrations to come up with a scheme that works and is acceptable, a conservation scheme that is acceptable in our fishing communities all around the UK?
Well, the honourable gentleman makes an excellent point, and he is a passionate champion, as he should be, for his local fishing communities. And he's right to highlight the concerns that have been raised, not just by them, but by members of the SNP's own party, about the potentially damaging impact of their plans to introduce the highly protected marine areas in the way that they are. I would encourage the SNP government to continue working with the Scottish fishing industry and coastal communities to understand their concerns, and as we've seen them recently U-turn on other poor thought-out decisions, hopefully they can relook at this one too.
Manchester.
The United Kingdom has a strong, deep, multi-dimensional relationship with Pakistan. And there are over 1.5 million British Pakistanis here, and many of them are dual nationals, as am I. The Prime Minister will have seen the scenes coming out from Pakistan, the civil unrest where people have lost their lives due to the detention of the Prime Minister, Imran Khan. There are real concerns about the circumstances of his detention and the right to have a fair trial. The United Kingdom has in the past sent observers to hearings around the world to ensure natural justice is done. Has the Prime Minister considered that? If not, will he consider it?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his question. The UK, of course, has a long-standing and close relationship with Pakistan, and this weekend, especially as Commonwealth partners. The arrest of the former Prime Minister is an internal matter for Pakistan. We support peaceful, democratic processes and adherence to the rule of law, and we are monitoring the situation carefully.
Carolyn Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A little boy has gone to school today in shoes that don't fit him because his parents can't afford new ones. A little girl had water on her cornflakes because her mum had no money for milk. These are real stories from Faith and Families, a charity in my constituency that deal with poverty every day. Poverty that is causing prolonged shame and leading to a mental health crisis. Faith and Families are worried about these kids. I'm worried about these kids. If the Prime Minister is worried about these kids, what's he going to do about it?
Mr. Speaker, we don't want any child to grow up in poverty, and that's why I'm proud that there are 1.7 million fewer people living in poverty today than in 2010 because of the actions of this and previous Conservative governments. That includes hundreds of thousands of children. And we are providing incredible support to the most vulnerable in our society as we speak. Just last week, the first of our cost of living payments went out, £900 to help the most vulnerable families in our society. Those are our values, and we will keep supporting them as the inflation remains high.
Alan Cairns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier in questions, the Leader of the Opposition sought to draw attention to council tax rates and council tax increases and offering some crocodile tears in the process. Can I draw attention to the Prime Minister's attention that whereas we have seen 43% increase in council tax rates since 2010 in England, the increase in Wales has been a staggering 67%. So therefore, is it not the case we should be looking at what Labour do rather than what Labour say?
My right honourable friend makes an excellent point. The Leader of the Opposition is very fond in telling us that Labour in Wales is his blueprint for how he would like to run the country, and as we've seen, all it means is higher bills for hard-working British families.
Shepherd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the last 2 years, the Drax Power Station in Yorkshire has, on average, burned almost 20,000 tonnes of trees every single day, releasing an equivalent amount of carbon into the atmosphere. During that time, whilst our constituents have struggled with their heating bills, the private company running Drax has received £1.5 million of subsidy through the government's energy policy every single day. This is set to continue until 2027. Can I ask the Prime Minister, will he step in and review this grotesque distortion of energy policy, which incentivises deforestation whilst making no contribution to tackling the climate emergency?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, while not being able to comment on the contract details of one particular company, what I can say is that our record on this issue is that since the benchmark was established, emissions in this country have fallen by almost 50%, whilst at the same time we've grown the economy by 2/3, not something I know the SNP government is as focused on as we are, but at the same time, because of the way that we regulate new and renewable energies, we've seen the price of renewables like offshore wind decline from £140 an hour to around 40. That shows a regulatory system that is working in delivering lower cost renewable energy for British families.
Costa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Plastic pollution is a scourge of modern day society. My 10-minute rule bill seeks to have microfibre, microplastic filters fitted in all commercial and domestic washing machines, legislation which France and other countries have already moved forward with. Will the Prime Minister, who has already done an enormous amount in tackling plastic pollution, will he organise a meeting between me and the stakeholders, particularly washing machine manufacturers, with the Secretary of State to discuss this very important issue?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we want to tackle microplastic pollution wherever possible, which is why we introduced a microbead ban and a tax on plastic bags. I know my honourable friend has campaigned for filters on washing machines, but he will also know they can be costly to install. DEFRA have outlined plans to make sure that we can use more filters, but I will ensure that he gets the meeting that he needs with the relevant minister to discuss this important matter further.
Stephen Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government ditching its pledge to recruit 6,000 more GPs is yet another example of the Tories over-promising and under-delivering, with teacher recruitment targets missed and housing pledges shelved. Why does the Prime Minister think that the only target he's actually met was the loss of 1,000 Tory councillors last week?
Maybe the Honourable Gentleman can tell us which of the many promises that the Leader of the Opposition made to him when he was campaigning he's most happy that he's U-turned on.
John Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Lincolnshire's roads, foodstuffs grown in our fine county are transported across the nation, but the Highways Authority struggles to fund roads because of the skewed funding formula devised by a previous Labour government. So many of our public services suffer, policing included. So will the Prime Minister agree to urgently review the local government funding formula, the police funding formula, so that Lincolnshire can have a fair deal?
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right to stand up for the particular needs of his rural community. And like him, I recognise that rural areas do often have higher costs of providing services. It's right that those are reflected where we can in funding formulas, but I'll make sure that he gets a meeting with a relevant minister to discuss this important matter further.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 13,450 prepayment meter vouchers have gone unclaimed in my Glasgow Central constituency at a value of over £887,000. Across Scotland, £16.5 million is unclaimed. The Prime Minister's Energy Bill Support Scheme is failing if money which could be helping our vulnerable constituents is resting in his government's account. I recall he's not very familiar with how prepayment meters work, but what will he do to ensure that every single penny gets out of government coffers and into the meters of those who really need it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful that the Honourable Lady for a Change acknowledged the support that the government is providing to families up and down the country. Particular attention was given in designing those schemes to how to get the support to prepayment meters. The ministers are always engaged with stakeholders to make sure that there is awareness of those schemes, and I'll make sure that we keep up those efforts so that people do get the help that they need and deserve.
David Morris.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's very interesting that the Leader of the Opposition says about keeping council tax low when the Labour Party voted to increase Morecambe Town Council from historically £400,000, £200,000 to £2 million. So, on that basis, I'd like to meet with the Prime Minister to see where we can find government time to cap parish councils from doing this sort of abhorrent behaviour.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right to highlight that council tax in Labour areas is higher than that in Conservative areas, which is not right at a time when there are pressures on the cost of living. I look forward to meeting him to discuss his plans to keep British families' household bills as low as they can be.
John Speller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Dozens of Sudanese doctors who'd been working in the NHS were stranded and not allowed to return here. Last week, the Minister told us here that the Prime Minister took the decision to get them back. So why hadn't such a straightforward decision been made much earlier by the Home Secretary or the Foreign Secretary? Is it because he's an obsessive micromanager, or is it that his ministers are just not up to the job? Which one is it, Prime Minister?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is completely wrong to describe as straightforward a complex and dangerous evacuation in a war zone. And actually, it is actually the case that everyone involved deserves enormous credit for conducting what was the longest and largest evacuation of any Western country from Sudan. During that process, it was right that we moved deliberately and carefully to ensure the security of everyone involved and to prioritise British nationals and their dependents. Now that the operation is complete, we can look back and thank everyone for what was an incredibly successful operation.
Dr. Luke Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since 2010, violent crime has dropped by 38% and neighbourhood crime has dropped by over 50%. But one crime that has gone up is fraud. Now, many of us have dealt with constituents who've struggled with fraud. What is the Prime Minister going to do about it?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. 40% of all crime now is fraud. It's damaging for people's well-being as well as harming their finances, which is why the Home Secretary and I just recently launched a new plan to combat fraud with significant new investment, hundreds of new officers to tackle it, and action on social media companies to empower people to take action and to stop fraud happening in the first place. It represents the most comprehensive plan to tackle this issue, and it will make a big difference to families everywhere.
Final question, Stella Creasy.
We're going to leave Prime Minister's questions at that point. If anything else develops, we will, of course, bring it to you. Let's welcome and introduce our guest for this part of the programme. For the Government, the Energy Minister, Andrew Bowie. For Labour, the Opposition, Shadow Transport Secretary Louise Haigh, and the BBC's Deputy Political Editor, Vicki Young, is here with us. Well, I suppose it's unsurprising that there was quite a lot of fallout from the local election results on Friday, which we covered in depth, of course. Keir Starmer said saying that Rishi Sunak had lost in places across the whole country. And why did he think he still had a mandate from anyone at all? Rishi Sunak, of course, in turn called him Mr Flaky, Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, because of flip-flops or changing his mind on various leadership pledges that he'd made. But there was a thread running through a lot of PMQs, and that was over the cost of living being faced by voters across the country. What did you make of it, Vicki?
Yeah, and the accusation from Sir Keir Starmer that the government is out of touch, that's his line of attack, isn't it? He does it in different ways over different weeks, but he's effectively saying that Rishi Sunak doesn't understand the pain people are going through and that he's not doing enough. As you say, a difference today talking about his mandate, which was an interesting sort of change of tack, basically saying, well, obviously the last election was won by Boris Johnson. Well, he's long gone. He's now had his own test at the ballot box and he hasn't come out well from it. And then the sort of slightly schoolboy trading of insults between the two of them. A bit on policy, talking about freezing council tax. That's one of Labour's policies, and saying why doesn't the government do the same thing? And of course, the rebuttal to that, which is always the government saying that actually it's Labour councils that have higher tax. But yes, Mr Softy, Mr Flaky, I presume this is an ice cream thing going on.
It is. I would guess that you're right on that. Since you've mentioned the issue of council tax, yes, it was something that the Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer mentioned about freezing council tax. Before I come to our guests, let's catch up with Oscar Bentley, who's been looking at this particular pledge made by Keir Starmer during Prime Minister's questions. Oscar.
Yeah, so Keir Starmer asked Rishi Sunak to commit to Labour's plan, which is freezing council tax for the next year and giving councils grant money in order to cover those bills. Now, Labour say that they do that through raising the windfall tax. So the windfall tax, that's the tax on oil and gas companies' excess profits. The sector's currently taxed at total 75%. Labour want to raise that to 78%. Now, they say over 2 years that would raise £10.4 billion and that their council tax plan would only cost £2.7 billion. Now, the difference between the current windfall tax policy and what Labour wants to do is something called the investment allowance. Now, that's a provision where companies, if they invest in their UK operations, they can get a tax deduction. Labour call that a loophole, but the government say it's a really important part of the tax because it means that we get investment in our domestic oil and gas production, which they say is really important. The other thing that's important to note about what Keir Starmer's saying is this is what Labour will do if they're in government now. It's not necessarily what they do when they hope to be in government at the end of 2024. It might not be needed. The economic picture may be quite different by then. So then, a couple of questions you might want to ask your guests, Jo. To your Labour guest, as I just said, what would you actually do in government? We're talking, this is now. We don't know what you do in the future. And to your Conservative guest, is Labour right? Is there a loophole in the windfall tax? Is it too easy for oil and gas companies to avoid?
Oscar Bentley there from the Political Research Unit at the BBC. Thank you very much. Would you like to commit now to Labour putting that policy in its manifesto for the next election?
Well, it won't come as any surprise, Jo, that I'm not about to write our manifesto here live on Politics Live.
If Keir Starmer was suggesting it for now, if he was in government now, he's surely in favour of that idea. It's only about 18 months away if we predict it's going to be in autumn next year.
Well, look, I think we've been very clear repeatedly that we want to see a massively expanded version of the windfall tax. We think it is totally wrong that the oil and gas giants are repeatedly posting record profits that are frankly made off the windfalls of war and the war in Ukraine, and that people are struggling at the moment. So what we're saying that we would do is take that money now and give it to councils in order to allow them to freeze council tax. But we've said more about what we will do in government. We've said we'll abolish the non-dom tax status in order to fund the biggest expansion of the NHS workforce in its history. We've said we'll close the VAT loophole on private schools in order to fund teacher recruitment and free breakfast clubs. So we have been very clear about a number of tax changes in order to make the tax burden a lot fairer and make sure that all our commitments are properly funded.
So at the moment it's just hypothetical, this council tax pledge, isn't it? It's a hypothetical for Rishi Sunak to decide whether he would like to adopt that policy policy. For Labour, we don't know whether you would actually do it. Could you commit to it? Would you like to?
It does demonstrating what we would be doing in government now, the different choices that we would be making. Rishi Sunak refuses to take advantage of the windfall tax properly and tax the oil and gas giants in order to help people through the current cost of living crisis.
Well, you're very sceptical and raising your eyebrows. Yeah. On that policy, would you do it? Would you think it was worth looking at freezing council tax and increasing and revisiting the windfall tax to pay for it?
Well, I think on council tax, the Conservatives can be judged by their record. In Conservative councils up and down the country, there is lower levels of council tax than in Labour-held councils. So Labour might pledge to freeze council tax. We actually charge residents in council-run areas by Conservatives a lower
Well, hang on, is that the case?
It's actually not true. Independent research ahead of the local elections demonstrated that Labour councils, on average, charge less council tax than Conservative-run councils.
That simply isn't true. I've not seen that research. I'd be interested to see that research.
It was published just ahead of the local elections, but on the basis of council tax in general, do you think it's worth looking at?
On freezing council tax, look, the Conservatives are always for lowering taxes where it's possible.
And paying for it by a higher windfall tax.
The windfall tax, which we now tax oil and gas companies 75% on the profits that they make in the North Sea. That 75% tax has gone towards paying for half of everybody in this country's energy bills over the past winter. I know that mathematics is a difficult concept and numbers are a difficult concept for the Labour Party. They have spent their non-DOM policy, I think, 3 times over now. There's only so many times you can actually spend money that's raised through a tax. We've spent the 75% levied on oil and gas, on supporting everybody in this country over the past winter. We also want to, of course, incentivise companies to invest and create jobs and maximise economic recovery from the North Sea, because oil and gas is important. It will be with us for the next 20 or 30 years, and I would much rather that we made use of the resource in British waters with British workers doing those jobs than importing, by the way, which would have much higher CO2 output, oil and gas from overseas.
Well, the chief executives of BP and other oil and gas giants have said it would make no impact on investment decisions here in the UK. I think it's a bit rich, any Tory MP lecturing anybody else on economics when his party willfully crashed the economy last year, raising people's mortgage interest rates, and we are all now paying the price for their economic decisions.
Bernard Looney, the chief executive of BP, said that about before we introduced the windfall tax last year. They are not saying that now. We are seeing companies not investing in the North Sea as a result of some of the decisions that we've had to take, regrettably, to support people through the past winter. The fact of the matter is, however, we cannot continue to spend over again the same amount of money that is being raised. Unfortunately, that's Labour's position, and it always has been. The mathematics simply does not add up.
Did you, though, hear Ben Bradley, Conservative MP in the East Midlands, raising the frustration he found on the doorstep in those local elections that the government is not delivering? It's made some pledges, including halving inflation, and we're going to talk about the issue of the illegal migration bill and small boats in just a moment, that frustration is being felt, feeding in to those local election losses because the pledges aren't being delivered. Do you accept that?
Look, last week was a difficult week for us. We completely accept that. It was a mid-term local election.
But this is a Conservative MP saying there's a failure to deliver.
Not perform as strongly as they probably should have at this point in the electoral cycle if they're seeking to form a majority government. But put that to one side, we are focused on delivering on the Prime Minister's priorities, and that includes halving inflation, growing the economy, stopping the boats, cutting waiting lists, and doing much more to ensure that the British people get from their government what their priorities are. That's all we are focused on right now. And so Ben is absolutely right to say that we need to deliver. That's what we're focused on doing.
On levelling up, though, that was the point Ben was making, wasn't it? That this government was elected on a mandate to level up. And we know for a fact that Rishi Sunak doesn't believe in levelling up because he boasted to Tory party members that he took money out of more deprived areas of the country in order to give it to the leafier areas.
Right, yes, that was a bit... well, we've shown that.
As Rishi himself has said, the point was that levelling up must mean levelling up across the entire country. No one place should be prioritised at the expense of another. That's what the Prime Minister was suggesting, rural as well as urban.
Vicky, at the moment, the Lords are debating the illegal migration bill. How much pressure is there on the government? Because the Lords can amend bills, but in the end, will it go through?
Yeah, it's about changing it, actually. The Lib Dems in the Lords do have a plan to try and kill the bill completely. It's very rare, but it's not going to succeed because Labour aren't behind that. They're making the point, and the government makes this point. This has already gone through the House of Commons, the democratically elected chamber. So this is about trying to make changes. And it's worth just reminding people about this bill. This isn't exactly about the Rwanda policy. This is about sort of making it work and basically putting a legal duty on the Home Secretary to remove those who have arrived through non-legal routes. So there's a lot of unhappiness, particularly about the detention of children, about more safe routes. And we have heard from the Archbishop of Canterbury today talking about the changes that need to be made.
Well, let's have a listen to a little bit more of him, Justin Welby.
It is isolationist. It is morally unacceptable and politically impractical to let the poorest countries deal with the crisis alone and cut our international aid. My Lords, this bill is an attempt at a short-term fix. It risks great damage to the UK's interests and reputation at home and abroad, let alone the interests of those in need of protection or the nations who together face this challenge. Our interests as a nation are closely linked to our reputation for justice and the rule of law, and to our measured language, calm decision, and careful legislation. None of those are seen here.
Do his criticisms concern you, Andrew?
Look, I always listen with a great amount of respect to anything the Archbishop of Canterbury says, but the fact of the matter is that we need to stop the abhorrent trade in human life that's taking place on the Channel. We believe that this bill will do that. We need to ensure that people traffickers are stopped. We need to ensure that we free up space in the asylum system so we can create more safe and legal routes, and that people that come here illegally know that they will be deported in the event that they get here. That is what this bill will achieve. Of course, I listen with great respect to what the Archbishop of Canterbury has just said, but I do disagree with him. This bill has been calm and measured and thoughtfully drawn up, but we need to act. We need to stop the boats. People expect us to do that, and that's what we're going to do.
Louise.
Well, Andrew's absolutely right that I think everyone agrees we need to tackle the horrific crime of people smuggling and very vulnerable people being trafficked into the country. But I think one of the very real concerns about this bill is that it actually empowers people smugglers. And we've seen through the passage in the Commons, and I'm sure we'll see it being debated in the House of Lords as well, that without it being made clear that victims of human trafficking who come here are not given support and are not treated as asylum seekers, then that will empower those people smugglers to exploit them even further. They won't be able to escape their grip. So that's why we're targeting specific amendments in the House of Lords. The one area I actually would disagree with the Archbishop is that this isn't a short-term fix. It's very similar to the legislation that was introduced by the government over a year ago, which declared that 18,000 people would have been inadmissible under the asylum seeker, but only 21 people were returned. So not only is it unethical, as the Archbishop has made the argument, it's completely unworkable as well.
Well, that's exactly why we're passing this legislation, because it's quite clear that prior legislation did not deliver what we wanted it to do. Hence the new bill, hence the new powers, hence our determination to crack down on the people smugglers and to deport anybody that comes here illegally. The British people expect us to do this, and we're going to deliver.
But there's no way to remove those people. That's the point, and the bill doesn't change anything in that. We're not going to see people being removed to Rwanda. The Home Secretary hasn't managed to negotiate returns agreements with other European countries, so it makes no difference, and it is really nothing more than a con or a gimmick that builds on the complete failure of the last piece of legislation.
I don't think it is a con or a gimmick. I think we will, as a result of this bill, see people being deported. I think we will see people going to Rwanda. I think the legal discussions are ongoing, and that's as it should be. And you talk about discussions with European partners. You know, we've done a recent deal with France, which will see them increasing patrols on the beaches. We'll see them establishing a new detention centre in Calais and increase the cross-border working on this issue. An issue, by the way, which is affecting every European country right now. We are all struggling to deal with the increase in illegal people trafficking into the continent of Europe, and specifically what we need to deal with is the trafficking of people across the Channel. Not only because it's abhorrent, but also it's putting people's lives in danger. It's a very dangerous route, and we need to stop it.
Yeah, but do you think, and have you sort of admitted that the previous piece of legislation didn't work? That's why this piece of legislation is necessary.
It's not that it didn't work. It's just that it needed to be essentially beefed up. Hence why we have brought forward this legislation.
I mean, in the end, if this legislation doesn't work, that will be extremely difficult, won't it, for a Conservative government under Rishi Sunak that has made this a key pledge. You are sort of, as your critics would argue, ratcheting up the means with which to achieve a pledge that so far has proven unachievable.
Look, it's a hypothetical question, Joe. Will it or won't it work? I believe it will.
Give me
We
the
believe
evidence.
it will.
Well, give me the evidence so far. Otherwise, why did you need this bill?
The bill is not in statute yet, so I can't give you evidence of something working that hasn't even been passed.
But previously, as you say, it didn't work.
We are introducing this piece of legislation so as to enable us to crack down on the people traffickers, to stop illegal migration and to deport people who come here illegally, so that we can, by the way, increase the amount of safe and legal routes, free up space in the asylum seeker for genuine asylum seekers. That is what we're seeking to do, and I think it would be in everybody's interest if we all got behind that. Right. Because as Louise has said, actually, on the points of principle within the bill, there's very little disagreement between the two main parties right now. We both agree that this traffic in human life needs to stop. It's just as to how we go about stopping that and how we go about getting the deportations up and running. I think this bill will deliver, and I'll come back on here once this bill is on statute, and then we can talk about the evidence as to whether it has or not.
As we know, it's 18 months till the next election. But actually, where Andrew is right is, as you say, of course you want to stop the people trafficking, but when it comes to an agreement with other countries like France, well, the government has achieved that. It's also got an agreement with Albania. When it comes to actually stopping a number of those boats, I think it's around 60% are stopped already. So progress has been made so far, insofar as that partnership with France. When it comes to the backlog, the huge backlog, again, the government has committed money. You may go further. But on the actual mechanism with which to stop those boats taking off, what has Labour got as its alternative plan?
Well, we've set forward a plan about funding a proper cross-border police unit with the police in order to better protect both our borders and the French's. And I would dispute that the government has managed to negotiate a proper returns agreement with the French. And, you know, as the Archbishop made the point earlier as well, by threatening to breach international law, by not setting the bill against the European Convention of Human Rights, it runs the risk of negotiating those agreements with our European partners, just as we saw over the Northern Ireland Protocol over so much time.
Although they have done it with France.
Well, they've not negotiated a full returns agreement. So,
but we have
got that commitment
we
have got that commitment to this cross-border police unit. And as you say rightly, the focus has to be on reducing that backlog of asylum cases, which has reached an astonishing 160,000 compared to the numbers in the low thousands when we left government.
We free up that space and we deal with the backlog by stopping the boats at source, and that is what this bill will achieve.
All right, let's have a look. We talked about it a little bit earlier yesterday, in fact, on the programme. That's about the half a dozen arrests that were made at the weekend on Saturday ahead of the coronation. The Daily Mirror has this headline: Met Police Chief defends unfortunate arrest of anti-monarchy protesters during the coronation. Louise, who or what do you blame for the arrests?
Well, the Met were absolutely right to apologise. I mean, from what we know of it, it looked completely wrong to arrest those individuals. I'm a former Metropolitan Special Constable myself. I know it's really difficult policing public order events and maintaining that right to free protest and the right for people to enjoy big events and to police public order. But it looks like that line was overstepped, and we warned repeatedly that this could be the case with the public order bill.
So it was an operational. You definitely saw it as an operational mistake by the Metropolitan Police.
It certainly looks that those arrests should not have happened, but the point is the legislation allowed them to happen. They allow suspicionless stop and search, which we think is completely wrong, that someone that is walking by a protest, that the police have no reason to be suspicious of, that is carrying anything or about to do anything, they can still stop and search them, and that is going well above and beyond what I was trained as a special constable to do, and what allows police to make very difficult operational decisions on the ground.
But in the end, it is their decision to make those choices on the ground. Except, of course, Andrew Peter Fahey, the former Chief Constable of Manchester, said that police have been left in an uncomfortable position, and the whole of policing is under pressure with officers trying to make sense of the legislation. And they had to do it very, very quickly, and within days of it coming in. Do you accept they are feeling political pressure over this?
No, I mean, look, I think we should heap praise on the police for the way that, on the whole, the coronation was policed. It was a huge public order event, and as Louise says, it takes an awful lot of effort to ensure that people are able to enjoy and people are also able to protest peacefully, as many did. Of the over 50 arrests that were made at the weekend, only 6 or so.
And they were a mistake, the police say.
That's obviously an issue for the Metropolitan Police, for which they have apologised. But let's be absolutely clear.
If that legislation hadn't gone in, would those arrests have been made?
Look, this legislation was brought in to protect the British British people going about their daily lives. They're frankly fed up of being prevented going to work, getting to hospital, going about their daily business, or enjoying big events such as the Grand National or others by individuals and organisations who seek to disrupt the ordinary lives of working people in this country. That's why this legislation was passed. It is right that where mistakes are made, the police apologise for that, but that, I'm afraid, is a matter for the Metropolitan Police.
Would Labour get rid of this Public Order Act?
Well, we support the Mayor Sadiq Khan's review, and we want to see an independent review as well by the Inspectorate Constabulary, but we oppose this legislation as it passed.
So if you oppose it, why won't you commit to repeal it?
For exactly these reasons. And the point, Andrew, actually, is that the police never asked for these powers. The police have perfectly sufficient...
The British people asked for these powers.
The police have perfectly sufficient
would you repeal
powers.
it then?
Well, look, we get asked about... We've had 13 years of legislation that lots of which we haven't supported. We're not going to spend the first year or first Parliament repealing lots of legislation. But of course we will put forward our own positive agenda, and we will revisit such legislation where necessary.
That's all we've got time for. Thank you to all of my guests for this part of the programme. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and on the BBC iPlayer. From all of us here, have a very good afternoon.